smiling man in the dark, it all started on a quiet autumn night. Mark had just moved into his new apartment-a decent one-bedroom unit in an old building downtown. It wasn't fancy, but it was cheap, and as a struggling artist, that was all that mattered. The neighbors seemed polite, though a little reserved. The first night, Mark noticed something odd. Just as he was about to turn off the lights, he spotted a figure outside his window. He lived on the third floor, so it wasn't someone on the street. The figure stood in the alleyway below a tall, gaunt man, dressed in a long black coat, staring up at his window with an eerie, exaggerated grin. Mark blinked, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was a trick of the shadows, or some guy messing around. But when he turned off the light, the man was still there. His grin never wavered. Unnerved, Mark closed the curtains and went to bed. That was just the beginning. Over the next few nights, the smiling man appeared again and again, always standing in the same spot. Mark told himself it was just some weird vagrant who wandered the streets. But then, things escalated. One night, he woke up at 3:13 a.m. to an odd, sound-soft tapping on his window. His heart pounded as he turned his head slowly. The smiling man was there, his face pressed against the glass. His grin was even wider now, almost unnatural. But that wasn't what sent ice through Mark's veins. The man was upside down. He was somehow clinging to the outside of the building, 3 stories up, grinning at Mark through the window. Mark scrambled out of bed, grabbed a baseball bat, and ran toward the window. But as soon as he pulled back the curtain, nothing. The alley was empty. Terrified, he spent the rest of the night with every light on. The next morning, he asked his neighbors if they'd ever seen the man, but they only gave him blank stares. "Maybe you're just seeing things," one of them suggested. Mark wanted to believe that. That night, however, proved he wasn't imagining anything. The tapping returned. This time, it wasn't just on the windowette, it was coming from inside his closet. Holding his breath, Mark gripped the bat tightly and moved toward the closet. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. With a deep breath, he yanked it open. Nothing. He let out a shaky laugh. Maybe he was going crazy, but just as he turned to go back to bed, he caught something in the mirror across the room. The smiling man was standing right behind him. Mark spun around, swinging the bat wildly, but there was no one there. His reflection was normal now. His breathing was ragged, and cold sweat dripped down his back. He didn't sleep that night. Desperate, he decided to set up his phone to record himself sleeping. Maybe he was having nightmares, sleepwalking anything that made more sense than a supernatural stalker. The next morning, he hesitated before watching the footage. The video showed him tossing and turning, nothing unusual until 3:13 a.m. The closet door creaked open on its own, and then, slowly, a tall figure emerged. The smiling man, he didn't walk. He floated toward Mark's bed, hovering inches above the floor. He bent down, bringing his face just inches from Mark's sleeping form. Then, as if sensing the camera, he turned directly toward it. His grin stretched wider, impossibly so, splitting his face almost in half. His hollow, black eyes locked onto the screen. And then he reached toward the camera. The footage cut to static. Mark's stomach turned. His phone suddenly felt like a brick in his hands. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out. Grabbing only his essentials, he bolted for the door. But as he yanked it open, his breath hitched in his throat. The smiling man was there, standing in the hallway. But this time, he wasn't grinning. He was screaming. A deafening, inhuman wail filled the apartment as the lights flickered violently. Mark slammed the door and stumbled back. The walls began to shake, and the air turned ice cold. The screaming grew louder, drilling into his skull. And then, silence. When Mark opened his eyes, the room was still. The door was shut. The lights were normal. Everything was fine. No smiling man. No screaming. Just the sound of his own ragged breathing. Mark didn't wait to question it. He grabbed his things and ran. He never returned to that apartment. He moved across the country, leaving everything behind. But no matter where he goes, every night at exactly 3:13 a.m., he wakes up to soft tapping on his window and a smile waiting in the dark. Mark tried everything moving, changing his name, even therapy, but nothing helped. The smiling man always found him. One night, exhausted and desperate, he decided to confront him. He set up cameras again, bracing himself for 3:13 a.m. As the clock struck, the tapping began. But this time, the smiling man didn't appear at the window. Instead, the closet door creaked open again. Mark gritted his teeth and held his ground as a shadow stretched across the room. A whisper filled the air. "You let me in." The lights flickered, and before Mark could react, an unseen force yanked him toward the closet. The cameras recorded only static and a muffled scream before everything went black. Days later, the apartment was found empty, except for Mark's phone lying on the floor. The final video showed nothing but an open closet and the faint sound of laughter in the dark. Mark was never seen again. But every new tenant who moves into that apartment wakes up at 3:13 a.m. to soft tapping on their window and a smile waiting in the dark.